track. Welcome to the second day of the 8th Annual Network Society Conference, Counterculture Resetting All Impossibility of Technology. We will continue with yesterday's keynote session. So we have here with us 3 keynote speakers. Our audience can scan the QR code to enter the Slido question box and leave your questions there. After each presentation, we will have a 20 minutes of Q&A session, so feel free to leave your questions on Slido anonymously. We're also broadcasting this session on Bilibili and YouTube. And I would like to invite all of you to follow our official account. Our first speaker is Lee Felsenstein, an American computer engineer. He played a very important role in the development of the personal computer, being one of the founding members of the Homebrew Computer Club and the designer of the Osborne 1, the first mass-produced portable computer. Felsenstein co-engineered the Computer Memory Project, one of the earliest attempts to place network computer terminals in public places to facilitate social interaction between individuals in the days before the commercial internet. His talk today is titled Social Media from Counterculture to the Future. Welcome. The floor is yours.
This does not work with a hearing aid. Thank you. First, I must explain that I am not an academic. I'm an engineer. And therefore, I will not attempt to make assertions that are based on fact. They will be claims that I make, and I invite everybody to test those claims against real life, because in engineering, you always work with imperfect tools and inadequate information, and you must therefore produce a result that will serve the necessary function. And that's always a matter of guesswork. So I ask you to judge me and my assertions here on this basis. Now, we see here a picture that I call the origin point for the social internet. 1964, it is taken against the rules by myself in the office of the free speech movement in Berkeley. Now, this doesn't look very computerized. It isn't. There's no computers in those days. There's just telephones. And it doesn't look very neat. Doesn't look very efficient. But in this inefficiency, an outcome was developed, I think, that is still redounding today. We see people busy listening to phones. There are only 2 telephones. And the items on the wall constitute the database, which was constantly changing as people called in. Now, a telephone room in a well-run company will have a good order, and information will come in, it will be recorded, it will be categorized, it will be passed up to the necessary people. Information to go out will come in, and it will be a flow of information going both ways, all very orderly, because the functioning of the business would rely upon that. That's not happening here. People are calling in for various reasons. Sometimes they have information they wanted to pass on. Sometimes they have a question they wanted answered. Sometimes they wanted to offer a resource. I think in one of these notices, I don't believe it's readable on this screen, someone is offering haircuts for free, because we were coming up on the time when the holidays would have people going home to face their parents, and often they would need a haircut. And they also named it Haircut Central. We sort of Bolshevik approach of naming everything Centralny, central. So this was within FSM Central. And so all manner of connections are being made through this set of phones and this desk and these people. And you may well imagine that you can't just put any people in there. The information is in part in the heads of the people as well as on the walls. Now, the reason why this is important, both for the immediate situation in 1964 and for the future, is that it was a part of a mechanism that allowed the campus community to form. Now, Berkeley is a big place. In those days, it was 20,000 students. Today, it's 30,000. And it was notorious for alienation. You came there, you were all alone within a massive crowd. You didn't know anybody, they didn't know you, and they didn't care. Now, when I got there, I actually liked that situation, but I'm a special case. Contrary to what we heard from the professor from Italy yesterday, the issue that the free speech movement formed around was the suppression by the administration of the university of the ability of students to organize to support the civil rights movement, which at that time was extending into the North. And in fact, 1964 was the particular year because in the summer of 1964, the Freedom Summer Project had attracted students from all over the country to get a taste of the terrorism that was prevalent in Mississippi and Alabama. And then they returned. A few didn't. And it was as if these were veterans coming back from combat. I remember the feeling well. Not that I was feeling it, they were, and you could tell that. And at that time, the university issued a new rule. There were tables that these student groups had set up just outside of campus. There was a wall of posts on the sidewalk. And thousands of people would stream past on the way in and out of the campus, and they could get information at these tables, they could give donations, they could sign up for participation, and in various things, including demonstrators in the galleries of the Republican National Convention that was held in San Francisco that year. And of course, that was the contention between the first of the, in effect, the MAGAs, Barry Goldwater, and some moderate guy named Scranton. And the local political boss was on the side of the MAGAs, and he was not amused by students being recruited at these tables to come over to San Francisco to the convention and make noise against his candidate. And so we understand, we don't have this in literal proof, that he put pressure, and others put pressure on the administration, because there were also protests underway to remedy housing discrimination, not housing, but employment discrimination. And there were sit-ins. It was rather disorderly at times. So the university was receiving pressure from outside. They issued this rule. And it was completely the wrong time to do it, because again, civil rights was not a distant matter. It was not just in the South. It had come right into our front yard. And the students who came back from Freedom Summer were heavily involved. So all of the student organizations, from the far left to the far right, from the Maoist Progressive Labor Party to the Libertarian, what was it, Society of Individualists, something like that. They were to the right of the campus Young Republicans, or the Cal Conservatives for Political Action. They all united as a united front to face this and to fight it. And since the university had discovered that they actually owned the land on that sidewalk strip out to much closer to the curb. We couldn't move the tables out, so the tables had to go into campus. And we engaged in classical civil disobedience, strategy known as filling the jails. We set up tables. Let's see, next. What's going on here? Forget it. Well, all right. We're not there yet. We are there. Maybe, here we go. All right, so I should have had this up.
You can just use this.
You want to move this?
No.
All right.
Just use this.
Yeah, okay. Let's go. I've already discussed this. We set up tables right in front of the administration building. If it's going to be illegal to have it anywhere on campus, that's as good a place as any. And deans would come out and take names of students for disciplinary purposes. As soon as they took one person's name, another one would take their place, take my name too. And eventually in that day, when they were summoned to the dean's office, 150 students showed up. Punish us. They weren't able to do that. The next day, this was October 2nd, 1964. The next day, excuse me, I'm wrong. This was September 30th. So October 1st, the protest continued, and the first non-student was cited, and this was like a gleeful opportunity for the university because a law had been passed in the last year that provided criminal penalties for anybody being on campus without being a registered student or faculty member. We got one. So they did the most stupid thing possible. In the middle of the day, shortly before the vast torrent of people were to come past, they brought up a police car. And they put this person, Jack Weinberg, in the police car. And what can you expect? Everybody shouted, "Sit down," and the police car was captured. And this grew and grew and lasted for 32 hours. Eventually there were negotiations, there was some kind of arrangement made. We went on for 2 months, till finally there was a climactic sit-in at the in the university building. I was involved, and 784 students were arrested. The faculty was shocked into recognizing the situation, and in a few days they voted in their faculty senate by a factor of 80% to support the student position. This provided the political support for to cause the owners of the university, the regents, to back off and say, well, we're not going to interfere with this. So suddenly, the campus became open to any and all kinds of student activity, whether or not it was approved by the university. Prior to that point, you couldn't hand out a leaflet on campus unless it was approved. Now you could hand out anything you wanted. I'm going to talk here about media structure because this got me thinking about it. I mean, I don't mean it got me thinking about it right now. I mean, it got me thinking about it in 1964. I was an engineering student. I adhered to the opinion, sort of vaguely left-wing opinion, that my future task would be automation and replacing labor, and that would somehow advance social progress. And I had tried to attach myself to the FSM office because I didn't have any classes or homework. I was working on campus for that 6-month period. And my quest was to find out what I could do as a technologist, because that's all I thought I could do. I was not going to change anybody's mind, but I could build things. And I will talk at a later time about what happened there, but the result was that I went off on a path of exploration, trying to find especially what media technologies would be effective. Now, the reason to this is that when December was the last month of the academic year, January of 1965, the campus was amazing. All sorts of people were doing all sorts of things in all sorts of fields. This we didn't expect. This was the opening of the counterculture, certainly in the Bay Area. There have been countercultures in the past, but the one we consider here is the counterculture of the 1960s. And I wrote some little essay, which somebody published. And of course, this is not what young engineering students do. We usually keep our mouths shut. But people weren't keeping their mouths shut, and they weren't staying in one place. In fact, we can estimate that some thousands of students dropped out, left the university, and turned up later in places like the Haight-Ashbury. They formed their own communities, and that was the key to it all. I want to look here, go back to looking at the media structure. What I came up with around that time and shortly thereafter was an analysis of media into two categories, broadcast and non-broadcast. Broadcast media emits the same message from one to many. Now, this can be on print, doesn't have to be in electromagnetic. And it can be done from noon rallies. We had noon rallies almost every day. Thousands of people would listen to what's going on about the crisis at the particular moment. We handed out leaflets. I helped produce those leaflets. That's the one thing I was able to do. And people would come to the campus in the morning to take the leaflets we had turned out, and they would go out, and they were risking discipline by doing so. And people knew that. And so each of them became a focal point for discussion. People would come up to them and say, well, why are you doing this? What's up? What's going on? What do you think? We also had a subscriber-owned radio station in Berkeley, which I think advanced the entire process because we had a kind of feedback loop. It was possible to get information into that station. It was non-commercial and run by people mostly like us. The non-broadcast medium were the discussions happening around the leafleteers. We also created an organizational structure with a large executive committee that really wasn't executive, but it had representatives from all living organizations and others. And this it provided a two-way information conduit. These people were involved in setting the policy. And there was a steering committee that they elected, which handled the moment-to-moment decisions. And some of those members of the steering committee were, in fact, replaced during the struggle, which is a little unusual among revolutionary organizations. But we had this path going out to all these people that were the constituents. We also had people who worked in the student recreation center and the art studios, and they would carry on discussion there. So we also had the telephone system and the information exchange on that. That counts as a non-broadcast medium. So we look at the telephone, symmetric, universally accessible, at least where we were. And I've already discussed the questions, suggestions, offer of resources. And what the process was, I call cross-connection. Now, that is an actual telephone technology term. Everything in the phone system is neat until it comes up to the point where everything has to be cross-connected from one set of wires to the other. That's a mess. There's almost no way to do that that's neat. So the notes on the wall, that was a mess, but it was the cross-connection. And what happened here, you couldn't go through the substantive discussions on the phone like that, on the phone room. They would have to cut it short. So you can divide the information into two forms, primary and secondary. Primary information is the content that you need to convey, the lecture, the whole story. Secondary information is who they need to contact and how to contact them in order to get that whole story. And so the telephone room was exchanging secondary information, and this worked. I mentioned that we succeeded at our goals from the objective standpoint, and then we had the magic of January 1965. Some students started an outrageous new magazine, a precursor to Rolling Stone, and advertised it with a gigantic spider mobile hanging over their table. Well, they had to take that mobile down. We agreed that it was okay to have regulations on time, place, and manner. But our position had been, in reference to the U.S. Constitution, First and 14th or fight. First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. I can explain that in legalistic terms later. It's not worth doing now. But when you have a nice slogan like that, you've got something. I mentioned how people were changing the direction of their lives. I was too. And it was a magical feeling. I wanted life to be like that all the time. And so, resolved to find the technological tools to make the process regular, rational. But it's a whole lifetime's worth of work, as I found out. So, the telephone information exchanges continued within the counterculture. They were called switchboards. That's not the proper telephone terminology, but it's, who cares? And by 1969, there was a listing of all of them for all the various causes, and whenever Gay Lib turned up, they had a switchboard. Call them and you're in contact with them. The underground press that I just mentioned started in 1965 to report upon the anti-war demonstrations, because the Vietnam War was heating up that year. So the anti-war activity followed and was made possible by the free speech movement. It's now called the alternative press, and it continues. There's no ending date on it. But these are little papers put out of houses and little offices. And I believe they could be a community media. So I went into them. I worked there as a writer. I learned journalism there. And I also saw what happened by the very structure of the media. They became loaded up with ads, personal ads, sex ads, and then display ads for sex matters. They made a lot of money for the publisher, but they were not community media anymore. And so I learned. The subscriber-owned radio station, KPFA, established in 1949 by pacifist anti-war objectors who had been imprisoned and otherwise had to do government service during the war, and they decided the media needs to change, and we'll set up a station that our listeners will own. Up on the FM band, the frequency modulation band was just opening up at that time, so there were no listeners. They had to make their own listeners. They had to build their own radio set and offer it to subscribers, and they did. And computer students began a project to bring the power of computers to the counterculture, and this is important because that's where my path leads me. They formed an organization. They actually took over a corporate shell from a switchboard, a San Francisco switchboard, which was going dormant, and set it up as Resource One in 1970. And I heard about them just about the same time that I had reached the conclusion on my own that what I was looking for was a network of computers. And this in 1970, you couldn't run out and buy that. That was a big deal. And I remember saying, well, where am I going to get a computer? 1 year later, I was in that group, Resource One. They had secured the long-term loan, which is in effect the donation of not only a good mainframe computer, but the very same computer that had been used by Douglas Engelbart in 1968 for what is called the mother of all demos, where he demonstrated the personal use of computers, a big mainframe computer, but this was a genius bit of work. And when I heard about that demonstration, I changed my thinking about what computers could do and how they could do it. Now, some observations, again, subject to question. People need a functioning community for a fulfilling life. I have a whole discussion on how that developed out of the Neolithic village, but I won't do that now. And a community can be defined as a group of people who communicate on a regular basis. Now I'm going to introduce the term agora, which is not a new term. It's Greek. It's the sort of the field where everybody hung out during the day, and the name derives from agon, the pain that the wrestlers felt when they were contending with each other. So in general, the agora is the place where information exchange occurs in public. This is very important. And people gain knowledge of who the other people are. So they become no longer isolated individuals. And this is where community forms. So that has been, we can see that in every community from antiquity. And then the interesting question is how that developed. I mean, this is, let's say that in the Neolithic village, civilization developed there, but not in the houses. It developed in the space between the houses, and that became the agora. So you find village squares, the Roman forums, Renaissance Piazza, the plain of Netherlands. It's everywhere. And through cultural evolution, which occurs on a much more rapid basis than biological evolution, the need for the agora is built into every one of us. That's something I'll posit, and I can't claim to have proved it. The agora is a commons of information. In effect, I'm creating a kind of a definition here. And like all commons, it can be captured and exploited and enclosed. The agricultural commons of England and so forth were subject to that, and that was the beginning of capitalism. And it happened to the agora. First of all, literacy, print. People could write stuff down, read it to others, read it to themselves. You had to pay something for that. So it's beginning to be privatized. And it's gone all the way to the fact that our agora these days is the mass media, which is a broadcast phenomenon. An agora that I've been talking about is non-broadcast. And therein lies the rub. There's where the change has to be made. So we set up the first social media system. There was a Resource One, and it opened in 1973. We have had, with the help of hackers like Richard Greenblatt, we developed an information retrieval system that was not tied to a predetermined set of indexing words. You could create your own index word. You just enter it. The machine took care of the bookkeeping. And we set up terminals technically without preloading them with data. Now, we did a little work to do that, admittedly. It was complete zero. But otherwise, beyond that, all the media, all the content, this magical stuff called content, was provided by the users themselves. We did not advertise it. We simply set it up in a few places that people frequented. We had to choose the place fairly carefully, and when we moved it, other people would use it, and the people wouldn't follow it. We discovered that out. But it was successful because people did use it. And whereas we had assumed that there would only be a few categories like jobs, housing, and cars, in part because the paper bulletin boards of the university were divided into those areas, that supposition went out the window. It was a tremendous range of things, which included a learning exchange dialogue. And one can look at the writings of Ivan Illich, I-L-L-I-C-H, I may mention that here, who was important to me. But he had written a whole book about deschooling society in 1970 or 71. And he, at the end of it, he said, well, what can we have instead of schools? Well, maybe computers can be used to connect people who know things with people who want to learn them, right? And some of our people had seeded an item into the database saying, where can we find good bagels in the Bay Area? Now, I must explain here, a bagel is a toroidal roll, baked roll. I think it's a Chinese invention, I'm not sure. And it became a Jewish specialty, which is mostly on the East Coast, and you couldn't get many, there weren't many places to get them in San Francisco. So 2 answers came in, here you can buy them literally. And the third answer was the winner. And it said, if you call this phone number and ask for this name, a former bagel maker will teach you how to, yes, okay, thank you. We'll teach you how to make bagels. We never found out if they actually did. So I'd like to say that we opened the door to cyberspace and found that it was hospitable territory. And the personal computer flowed out of this. We needed to have terminals that would work in public. There I was, the hardware engineer. I didn't know much software. And I began an investigation. And what came of this was preparation for the arrival of the personal computer in 1975. We also had social media developing elsewhere. The bulletin board systems using telephones. I'm going to skip through this. And the usual commercial networks. Now, each of these examples, so I can be asked legitimately, how much money did you make at this? And the answer is we didn't make any money. It cost us money. For those who went in the direction of something that made income, as soon as they could get some money going, they stopped development. We were there to continue that development. And we can see today that social media has generated a number of problems, this tribalization, siloization of discourse, distortion of the polity. I mean, we're living this in the US right now. And a distraction. So, just one point, the technical model for how information is stored in most social media systems is the papyrus scroll, not any more advanced than the Egyptians. And I'll discuss that privately with anyone as to why that is. So we need to be able to plan an alternative direction, and we need to work out how to manage the commons of information. Every commons must have management, and it develops organically if the commons is to survive. There are people around who write books saying, oh, there's a tragedy of the commons because everybody will be greedy and go for their maximum self-interest. No, that's Adam Smith talking. That's not the historical commons, like fisheries, agricultural commons. Each of those had processes for self-management. We need to invent processes for self-management for the commons of information. And one thing that I didn't have the word for, I thought we had to have something called the inspectorate. And these are people who are empowered to investigate, but not empowered to do anything about it. And it was finally a professor named Porkson in Germany, writing a book, Digital Fever, who contacted me and asked me to write an introduction. He says this is journalism. That's what we were missing. And he's right. So we need journalism. Now, I suggest a model of public parks. People say, well, how's it going to pay for itself? How do public parks pay for itself? They don't. And they serve many of the functions of the agora. And I have been saying for years that the natural custodians of the commons of information are librarians, or at least people educated that way. And there's the Internet Engineering Task Force, which has been working for decades on a voluntary basis to keep the Internet working, where there has been constant attempts to take them over by different private concerns, which are all rejected by the members because it's workers' power. These are the engineers who do the work. They're going to not let somebody tell them what to do. And I think we're there. I think we're at the end. Well, so I'm going to be trying to continue my work because people are now asking me, aren't you sorry? I'm not sorry. We have much more work to do, and I think we can chart a course this way, which is not the course that's going for what we call social media today. They'll do their own thing. I'm not interested in stopping them. We couldn't stop them. But we have to provide the structures, the culture, and the practices of self-management of our commons of information. And I can help, and I think you can too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. All right. So speak in Chinese. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Felsenstein, for your wonderful presentation. You shared with us a lot of the personal stories, and you narrated in a very friendly way the development of the computers and also your contribution to the development of computer. And we also look forward to you continuing with your work, and also to look forward to seeing your future outcome. So thank you again. All right, we will open the floor for questions. So let's first invite our on-site audience to ask questions. Any questions for Professor Felsenstein?
I'm not a professor, I'm an engineer.
All right, sorry. All right, if there's no questions, then okay. We have a question?
Hi. Well, thank you for this amazing presentation and all the engaging stories. So I'm wondering, out of things that you see, that exist right now, what comes closest to the type of system or institution that you're envisioning? Right. Yeah. So when you talked about librarians as information mediators or commons of information that serves as a public space, where one could meet others, I immediately thought of a public library. Right. I was also thinking about scientific literature and how that operates. Well, yeah. So I'm wondering if there are particular institutions or systems, online or offline, that to you right now seem like the closest thing to an ideal model.
I don't think I'm sufficiently informed to give a good answer to that question, because I have not become a media critic yet. I criticize media, yes, but I am still trying to build stuff. And so it helps if you don't know too much about the competition, or they might scare you away. So I don't have a good answer for what's closest, but I invite everybody to try to find the answer themselves that works for them and discuss it. That would be the most productive outcome. So I can't give you a definitive answer to this, and not that. No, sorry. Do you have another question? Oh, we have a hand up. No, yeah, that's it. Whoever. I thought the woman next to you was raising her hand, but maybe not.
Thank you for what you have shared. And my question was, maybe, like you said, it should be a question for myself to think further on, but I was wondering about your, in a skilled set way. I have been wondering if today for our immediate realities, for example, the Chinese society, I understand the social structure is different from a structure you have lived through or provided as a different social structure where, for example, if organizing things in a public park today as the alternative is easier or a bit different from what we can do here. And also, I have been thinking about if we wanted to create a new social media structure today, it would be, like, we have to move people from, for example, WeChat, migrate these users to a new structure. And that wasn't the case for the 1960s, where there weren't that structure to begin with. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on, I guess technical, I don't know, expertise on building tools in a different structure, or because maybe I lack the technical knowledge on if there's any different networks we could use, for example, like Bluetooth, or I don't know.
So I maybe I'm a strange phenomenon here, but I know a lot about the past, and I'm trying to do the future, but I don't really know that much about the present. First of all, the public parks is a metaphor. I'm talking about using the same organizational concepts, and they have provided answers to a lot of objections that would be brought up. I'm not saying we do it literally in the public parks. So let's be clear about that. And I'm aware that Chinese society is much different than Western society, and we're aware of the fact that I've only researched in Western society and Middle Eastern society, not much. You know, most of my education comes from absorbing things in my time in Berkeley, which was actually 29 years because I lived there and ran a business. So a lot of research has to be done into anthropology, and in fact, I understand there's a great museum here, and I very much look forward to visiting it to begin my education in Chinese cultural history. One thing I do have experience with is the process of development of unexpected things. And it takes a certain narrowness of vision. So if you learn everything about everything, you know all the ways to do it wrong. So you limit the width, the breadth of the things you learn, you have to study, and you move forward on the basis of vision. You can't prove you're right, but you have this vision, and the best thing you do is to implement and test, implement, experience, and analyze. That's just the dialectical process. So, again, anyone coming to me for the book on how to do it, well, I will have a book coming out, maybe in a year. I've written it, and it goes into great detail about what I've been saying and more. And I hope that people will not just read it as an interesting artifact and say, look at this crazy guy, but rather say, what I saw right there in that part of it got me thinking about something. That would be the best outcome. I don't have any better advice than that. Get my book, right? Okay. We will try to do a Chinese edition. I'll talk to my publisher about that. But I think I'd probably need to check with some of you about how that reads. Anyway, so I wish you all luck, let's say. I'm counting on being around for up to 15 years if I'm lucky, but then the Lee Felsenstein of 15 years from now won't be much like now. I'll probably be nothing but a self-appointed oracle, ready to tell everybody how to do anything, and to whom nobody should listen. So, but in the meantime, I do expect to be able to produce some kind of artifact, some kind of new version of community memory based on not just what I've learned. That's not the important part. It's what everyone contributes. And so that's what I want to look forward to. Did you, Rodrigo? Oh, Mark.
I was just, you talked about the scrolling and the papyrus scrolls, that we've come back to that. I was just curious if you wanted to say a little more about that.
Well, every computer, from the first ones, has to have some editing capability. And you have a chunk of information, and it's a file. And you are always able to append things at the end of the file and grow it downwards like a scroll. And that is where most of the social media systems we know about began and ended their development. However, with community memory, we treated it more like a book. And it had an index. And the fun part was that the readers could create the index and index their items and so forth. We improved that through 3 generations of development into a dual data structure whereby you could append your item, you could not append, you could attach, you'd link your item using hyperlinks in effect to another item, or you could add index words, or any reader could add index words so that they showed up in a different place. And well, we hardly got to start that in operation. It only ran for 2 years. That's where I'm going to start on the next one. So computers are capable. They can do things that we can't. Otherwise, we currently, if you're going to look in Craigslist, in theory, you go to a section and you start reading the entire bloody scroll of entries. Now, that's so long that these days you just can only do 1 day's worth. And so every time you place an item onto Craigslist, you have to go back and enter it again to keep it alive. And so you have this huge scroll developing that no one will ever read. And then we have the Slack and Discords, which are made for gamers, for over-caffeinated teenagers who just want to have a place they can write something and see it, so people can see it, and it just scrolls out to the infinity and never gets seen again. So you see, the structure has its uses built into it. So we're more interested in having indexes and be able to create conversations. And that's really the unit of of social media as I see it. And in fact, we're going to, I hope, try an experiment soon here where we allow people to do this in physical space and record the results. And I certainly hope that I am not proven wrong. But if I do, I'll work from there. Okay.
好的，谢谢菲尔森斯坦的回答。
We thank you for your wonderful answer. With that, we will move on to our next question. From our Slido question, here we have a really rather lengthy question. He says that in the movement in the 1960s, we found that even for students majoring in social science or with a technical and engineering background, they are very strong in taking initiatives. And they are very motivated in taking initiatives. And you can see that there are changes in mindset. There are also the change of mindset that leads to strong actions. But however, nowadays, you are seeing those students majoring in the technical and engineering background are losing their motive in taking actions. And how about students majoring in social science be motivated to learn more about the technical background so as to promote their own studies?
The best thing I can suggest is conversation among the various, shall we call them tribes? I don't know. I don't like that. But but and in fact, social media could facilitate that. But nonetheless, the important conversation is in the individual discussions. I suppose that the big question in the room is always, how can I make a lot of money on this? And we can start from the standpoint of, you won't make a large amount of money on this medium, but people can expand their opportunities in the world through it, and you can too. So it's a matter of, I mean, there's a joke from long ago on the radio. Someone says that they're getting central heating installed in their house, so they're putting the radiators outside. Why is that, says the straight man. And he says, well, if the outside's warm, the inside's warm. And so that should be the mindset. We want to make the outside warm so the inside can be warm. And this is presents a sort of cultural problem, you know, to get this information through people's heads. I don't know how you do that, but I see it. But discussion and conversation, especially at a one-to-one level, is what's going to be needed. So you need to create forums where these conversations can happen. I'm sorry I can't be more detailed about that. I mean, whenever I'm presented with a problem, I'm supposed to generate a plan. That's what engineers do, and I don't have a plan for this. But you can do that too, okay? So is there more?
我们看一下时间，好像
It seems that we are running out of time. Do we have still time? On Slido, we have one more question. That is about Mastodon, a new type of social media. He says this. He says it in English. Let me read it out for you. I will do it in Chinese, and then our translators will do it in English. You know, for Mastodon, mass media today, can they solve those social problems faced by the social media today?
Do you think today's federated social media, such as Mastodon, can solve the social media as business problem? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't know about Mastodon. I've just heard it. I've named it. So I can't give you an informed answer. Will something that has been developed for one purpose work for another purpose? Maybe, if you're lucky. But you will probably have to use it in a different way. And that's where that's cultural transformation. That's how it works. They didn't intend it to be used that way, but everybody's using it that way. And so either they follow along or just be happy that they're making money. But that direction is not something that is preordained. So Mastodon has some purpose. I don't even know what it is. And its usership will have to make its purpose into their purpose, not the other way around. And they will have to develop practices, myths, literature, and be able to talk among themselves in that language that describes what they're doing, using words and terminology that haven't been used before. Cultural appropriation, I think that's the word for it. It's time we did some cultural appropriation, hey? So I can't answer it directly to Mastodon per se, but in general, that's what's going to be needed.
好的，那么我们今天的问答时间到此就告一段落了，非常感谢。
With that, we would wrap up this session of discussion. We thank the speaker for his wonderful speech and his serious and elaborate explanation of the questions raised. We thank him for his wonderful speech, and we look forward for more opportunities to have in-depth discussion with him. Thank you. Our next guest is Mark Weber. He is an award-winning technical writer and journalist and a curatorial director of the Internet History Project at the Computer History Museum. His initial investigations as a journalist shaped the Internet History Project, which assembled the first archive of early web material and interviewed more than 80 key figures, including Lee and his colleagues, with the crucial help of web's principal inventor, T. Berners-Lee. He has curated more than a dozen exhibitions, excluding the museum's permanent exhibition, networks, and mobile galleries in Revolution. He has been consulting on technical topics since 1987 and is also an editor of 4 Computer Consultants How-To Guide. He holds a BA in neurobiology and creative writing from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. His talk is entitled From Links to Artificial Intelligence, Multimedia and Its Roots in the Hypermedia Dreams. Let's welcome Mr. Mark Weber.
Attention, I have a microphone. Friends, Romans, and countrymen. Okay. So I'm Mark Weber, curatorial director of the Internet History Program at the Computer History Museum, which is quite a mouthful. I want to thank Professor Wang for inviting me and for his generous hospitality, and Yixi Liu for making the connection. I'm honored to be here and to have been able to welcome some of you to the Computer History Museum. People tend to think of multimedia and hypertext, like the web, as on separate tracks. They're merely 2 advances that hit the mass public in roughly the same time period. People rarely think of them as deeply intertwined for over 100 years in ways that are sometimes at odds with each other, as we shall see. So the image there is from the plans of one of the pioneers of multimedia, Paul Audrey, for a world city to house the hub of the proposed worldwide network near the site of the League of Nations in Geneva in the 1930s.
Press the down button.
Thank you. But first, a little bit about the Computer History Museum. We have the largest general collection of computing materials in the world, including a media archive open to researchers. About 40% of our collection is physical objects. The rest is papers, video, images, software, and data. We've conducted over 1,200 video oral histories. Our permanent exhibition, Revolution, the First 2,000 Years of Computing, was the first to cover the evolution of the online world in depth. Our software exhibition explores the social role of software as it gets connected and goes online. I was proud to put one of the community memory terminals, which Lee Felsenstein worked on, in Revolution. Most of what I'll talk about today relates to multimedia and hypertext, but we also have a lot of material on the canonical history of interactive graphics, from the PDP-1 restoration, where you can play Space War, to Ivan Sutherland's 1968 virtual reality headset, the first one. Our biggest artifact is our building, built as Silicon Graphics sales headquarters. And the Internet History program builds on the museum's world-class collection of networking and mobile materials, as well as materials assembled by the earlier Web History project. Our goal is to preserve and tell the stories of the online world and the people behind it, as well as those whose lives are transformed by it, from smartphones to the gig economy. Around a quarter of the museum exhibit galleries are on net and mobile topics. The program also engages a broad audience with live events, publications, and videos. And we're currently working on a chatbots exhibit, which is very topical, to open next June. And oh, I'm sorry. I did not click. I should have. That's the Internet History program. And there's, for the chatbots exhibit. So we're not going to show this particular fortune teller automaton, but we're actually going to show one of the same genre. People have been trying to get machines to talk for quite a while. So in terms of graphics, my own first jobs were testing paint and draw programs in the late 1980s for Activision, Apple, Electronic Arts. And these were part of a larger trend in tools to let ordinary people produce media of different kinds, from music to video to page design. And that was really part of the personal computer revolution, the idea to give people tools. We preserve these and many other kinds of software. Though that access to tools has gone away in many ways with more recent computers, although it's increased in others. So by the early 1990s, multimedia on personal computers was getting surprisingly good, helped by CD-ROM readers. Games were getting really vivid. Hypertext was best known through HyperCard, which could also create interactive CD-ROMs. It was all standalone. These were not networked for the most part, but the media future looked very rich. Better and better graphics, sound, all those things, until the web bombed it all back to the Stone Age. Basically put it back at least a decade. So in 1995, I was executive editor of this experimental many-media magazine with partners including The Economist Group, The Guardian, Le Monde, Ad Age, Swiss Radio and TV. It was a huge accomplishment that we could integrate audio clips, very short ones like the microphone icon that you can click on, into it at all. And my TV interview with Jim Clark was broadcast as video on the M-Bone, which I don't know if any of you would remember, but it was about 2 frames a second, maybe. That was video over the internet at the time. And the limit was not expertise. The magazine's publisher was the firm that was co-founded by Jean-Francois Graf, who wrote much of the web itself with Tim Berners-Lee. The limits were about bandwidth and certain choices made as the web grew. But the tension, which I'll talk about a little bit, but the tension between representing content and spreading it around goes much further back. So people have been creating in different media for a long time, from music to dance to cooking to verse. But the fact that language is made up of discrete words made it especially easy to copy quickly and accurately. That also made it ideal to encode in compact symbols, starting about 5,000 years ago. So some form factors seem to recur. To the right is actually a wooden writing tablet covered with erasable wax. But even clay tablets, like the one at left, used cross-references, which you can consider an ancestor of the hyperlink. But the point, though, is that words can be represented and copied kind of infinitely without losing resolution the same way that other media are. So while anyone literate can copy writing with very few errors, copying even simple illustrations requires interpretation and skill. Early printing, too, was designed mostly for text. It took a long time for illustration to catch up. So, for instance, ancient Greek and Roman scholars illustrated their text, like Pythagoras with geometry, but most of those were lost when they were copied. You end up with just the text, with the images stripped out. And obviously, printing, movable type printing, which started in Asia but then became very big with Gutenberg in the West, is not designed for illustration. That's purely for recurring characters or letters. So light-speed digital communication started in 1837 with the telegraph, but it was initially text only. For the first time, 19th century inventors captured images, sounds, and even motion as movies, but that was not going over the telegraph. Aside from the telephone, all of those media required physical transport. They were completely locked. And by the 1920s, information pioneers like Paul Autley, Henri de La Fontaine, who worked with him in Belgium, began dreaming of something like a World Wide Web, or as H.G. Wells called it, a world brain, tied together with a type of hyperlink. But the same completist urge that inspired these visionaries to link all the knowledge in the world also drove some of them to try and include every medium. So not just paper and microfilm, which was new, and it was the compressed media of the time, but telegraphy, telephony, radio, recorded sound, and still experimental television. So at Wright is Autley's proposed Mondotech, like world, it's not easy to translate, but for the home, which would include a whole bunch of those gizmos on it. You would have, 6 different kinds of machines to handle different media. And he was convinced that you did need multiple media to effectively transmit knowledge. You can learn from text, but having motion and sound and images gives a much richer experience. So he and Henri de La Fontaine went a long way to building a working system in Brussels using all the technologies I just described. They were committed internationalists and had enormous faith that shared information would lead to world peace and a general golden age, a dream that recurs periodically amongst pioneers of information technologies. There were some like that around the telegraph, early radio, the web, of course. De La Fontaine also collected feminist literature and pamphlets and was a key supporter of women's rights. And there was a whole world of this between the wars kind of internationalist, pacifist activity in Europe that this was one expression of. Autley worked with Le Corbusier and other architects to plan a world city to be the nerve center of the worldwide network. He planned to locate it near the League of Nations, first in Brussels, and then when Brussels lost the bid, to host it in Geneva, Switzerland. So they were part of this loose network of information visionaries with pacifist internationalist ideals. And they were also exploring the first machine-readable medium, so holes in paper or film, to navigate information. And this goes back to hollow earth card sorters like IBM card sorters, Jacquard looms further back. But one of these, so this is the dawn of automated search. So using machine-readable media holes in paper for essentially the intelligence, the computing that would go on in information search. And Emanuel Goldberg worked at Zeiss Icon in Germany, headed their research lab, and they were doing early television, they were working on microdots. But we think of automated search as being a recent thing, but he pioneered search using photocells and punched 35mm film with microfilm pages. So you could enter a numeric code, kind of like a URL or a web address, and it would bring up in a few seconds the page that corresponded to that on your screen. And he even built it into his desk at Zeiss Icon like a workstation. And in the same period, two of the fellow travelers with these kind of ideas, Wilhelm Ostwald, who was a chemist, I think a Nobel laureate, was building something called the Bridge in Germany to standardize all sorts of formats, share information. H.G. Wells, the science fiction author, also wrote a book called World Brain, where he proposed a very similar set of ideas and went around evangelizing these. Both were very, confident that sharing information could bring about peace. But the Second World War erased knowledge of most of this work. Ironically, the bits that came to English-speaking computer pioneers were really only through Vannevar Bush's Memex concept, which was a kind of microfilm web browser that expanded on Goldberg's search engine. So Goldberg was doing essentially one screen where you could enter a set of numbers and come up with a page, like a URL, but there was no ability to link between. So the Memex, you have two microfilm readers next to each other, and you could create links between them. So it's a big jump in the idea. But Bush was a father of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb effort in the United States, and one of the heads of military scientific research in the United States. So, you have these very similar ideas coming from very, very different people with very, very different goals. And, it can seem paradoxical, but I think there is actually a common kind of willingness to push into new frontiers, to push boundaries between idealists and military researchers. And I think there is, there's an element of what people were talking about yesterday, that there can disruption, there's a commonality to disruption. But I would argue that, the goal is still very important. Many kinds of people want to disrupt the social or technological order, but what they're trying to solve for actually is quite important. There's a very different set of goals. But certainly we'll see as you move into the 1960s in Silicon Valley that, there's a common kind of courage to explore new ideas on both sides that, is in tension but was also potentially creative. I showed you all the pre-war, Paul Otlet, H.G. Wells, all these ideas of combining media involved lots of equipment, complicated, finicky, heavy equipment. Starting in the 1950s, Doug Engelbart, Ted Nelson, and others realized that you could do something like the Memex, which was meant to be on microfilm, but using the digital computer, and that you could do it all in one machine. And Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, had even proven that ones and zeros, bits, could represent any medium digitally, which was not clear before. It was not, I don't think it was obvious to someone in the 1920s or 30s that you could use the exact same storage for all of these different media and mix and mingle them into one kind of omnimedia. So although they didn't know of Paul Otlet, pioneers quickly began dreaming of linking multiple media. So Ted Nelson actually started with video hypertext ideas. He was interested in film, and he wanted to have films that would link to other films through particular places. Doug Engelbart and Andy Van Dam, the latter of whom had turned to graphics early on, tried to cram in as much graphical capability as they could into these very limited computers at the time. So the tension here is that they are thinking of using the computer to combine all media, but a computer at the time had almost no memory and no ability to display even simple graphics, very limited ability. There, by the way, Doug Engelbart at the custom workstation by Herman Miller that he used in the mother of all demos that Lee referenced. And we have a reproduction of this at the museum done by some of the original people who worked on it. Andy Van Dam kept on with more and more multimedia-oriented hypertext. This is from the 70s, a mock-up of a visual hypertext system for technical training. But computers through this period were very limited for multimedia. So they were infinitely flexible, but their resources were limited. And we have a number of examples of the kind of awkward in-between period when people were trying to get computers to do more than they could with the memory and processing of the time. And they were mixing analog with digital. So this is from, these were aperture card from the actually pre-computer era, but into the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, I believe some of Apple Computer's early blueprints were done on these. So you have an illustration like a blueprint in microfilm on the right, and this card can be sorted in a computerized card sorter to find the right image. So it's a way to track a library of images, but the images are not in the computer. They're on this little separate piece of microfilm. And so here's the IBM 1360, which was stored data chemically, and it could store enormous amounts of data used by the CIA, amongst others. This was tremendously powerful, but again, analog. It's not actually digital the way the data is stored. The Plato 4 education terminal had a flat touch screen in 1974, but for this image is actually microfilm projected on the screen. It could control a microfilm reader inside the terminal. They also had audio in a similar way with a magnetic audio disc. The Aspen movie map, early 1980s, what became the Media Lab at MIT, hooked up an analog video disc. These were originally created for video to a mini computer. So it's basically Google Maps with Street View, and we've showed it in our exhibit on that, but using this analog video disc controlled by a computer. Apple's Visual Almanac controlled a video disc player from a Mac. And this is from a show and tell we have in the collection. So you had an entire encyclopedia on the video disc. But not everyone thought connectivity did not mix well with hypermedia. Some dreamed of interactive television over broadband, and Hyper-G, system developed in Austria there, was hypermedia for the internet. Intermedia, at the right, was running over local area networks with powerful multimedia in the 1980s. But these were exceptions, and running over networks that were not available to most people. So Tim Berners-Lee, when he came up with a web with other people, Robert Caillou and others, it was Tim's idea, planned all kinds of ambitious media for his World Wide Web system, and it would be handled by format negotiation and mime. Basically, it would adjust to whatever kind of machine you were on. If you had a powerful machine, it would show you beautiful graphics or sound or movies. If you had a very simple terminal or a mobile device, it would sort of downgrade it automatically to show you what it could. But he didn't have time to add those to this demo browser on the next machine. This is the first browser, which was also an editor. The web was meant to be much more interactive. And with a very little funding, he asked volunteers to make Unix browsers. That was the platform that he needed to get out. He also asked them to add flexible multimedia. But the most successful browser, Mosaic, quickly added bitmaps, and only bitmaps, in a way that made it very hard to embed other media. So it basically froze a very limited graphics capability into the web for a number of years. But the images definitely attracted people and made the web, helped the web succeed over rivals like Gopher. At the same time, the virtual reality markup language community was pushing 3D web browsers in a wave of optimism, and virtual CAD systems like Venus at CERN, which was shown here, used to develop particle accelerators, were very successful on high-end equipment. This was for people that had high-speed lines and very expensive workstations. The average person on the web had very, very limited multimedia at that time. But eventually, online multimedia caught up, both from broadband and from better compression in the form of MP3, broadband connectivity like ADSL and cable, and flash music. So these were popularized by Napster and other musical pirate sites, by adult sites for flash, but it finally brought, basically by the late 1990s, the web was up to the level of multimedia on a standalone machine, maybe in the mid-1980s. So it took quite a while. And a number of the people that, certainly Ted Nelson, Doug Engelbart, were approaching hypermedia from a counterculture point of view, that they were really hoping, again, a little bit like Paul Otley and people in the 20s and 30s, hoping to improve the world by sharing knowledge, and with a real faith that that would be effective. And I wanted to show that so counterculture in the Bay Area, you know, the 60s, 70s is the most famous period, clearly, but this is actually from the Cacophony Society, which is the organization that launched Burning Man in the early 1990. This was a strange confluence of, you had virtual reality, you had Timothy Leary, Stuart Brand, and the Cacophony Society doing this event in 1990 with early virtual reality. And the connection between counterculture, people around Burning Man, and the computer industry continues. It can be, you know, there's every type of person involved, and certainly you can have it as a kind of exclusive club for captains of industry in Silicon Valley, but there's also people with a whole set of different goals. Today, online multimedia has finally caught up, technically, to what you could do with a CD-ROM many years ago, but now in a network of 4 billion people. But the question I would pose is, have the applications? Zoom is a realization of a 100-year-old idea of video conferencing and a 50-year-old reality. That's video conferencing imagined by Paul Otley at Wright in the 1930s, very similar to what people do now. And demonstrated by Doug Engelbart and the mother of all demos in 1968. So the question is, you know, what are we going to imagine next that we finally fulfilled? We can mix any medium online instantly, cheaply, at very high resolution. But what are we going to do with it? And I think a real wild card, of course, is generative AI, where most of the hypermedia pioneers had been imagining a human being picking and choosing all sorts of media and combining them into some kind of omnimedia presentation. But generative AI, as one of the speakers was saying yesterday, it breaks things down into these little fragments, almost these packets of either speech or images, and recombines them. And I would argue that it's just bringing in a whole nother factor, which is that the AI is generating or making a number of the decisions. It's more like an interaction between the person and this almost channeled collective unconscious of imagery or words. So it's a technique that's more like selectively breeding than designing something. It's more evolutionary, that somebody, as the artist was saying yesterday, choosing amongst many, many images that the AI generates is quite different than imagining something and making it so. And I think the contrast is, there's an older vision of brain-computer interfaces that in the future you would be able to literally imagine a scene in your head and have it appear on the screen, or imagine music. That would be much more direct control than generative AI, because generative AI, you bring in that other party, which is the AI, that's mixing things in ways that you may or may not want, and that you're having a dialogue with. So I think it's an interesting next chapter in this kind of bringing together of all media, mixing them, and figuring out what to do with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Weber, for your wonderful presentation. You talked about the hypermedia, hypertext, and you talked about the development of media technologies, and towards the end, you also talked about artificial intelligence. So now we open the floor for questions. Let's see if the on-site audience have any questions for you. So any feedback, any comments, any questions from the audience? All right. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I have a question on preservation. So preserving hardware and software, which is more difficult? Because, sometimes the curators might see that there's only one piece of it, and it's very difficult to ship it from overseas to China. And it's very difficult to replicate the code, or it's very difficult to bring the hardware to China. So in terms of preservation, do you think it's more difficult to preserve the hardware, which is very ancient? Do we need to make it more commercialized, to open it to the public? For example, Exitube from SSR. I know that it's already, they're no longer producing it. So for these ancient items, shall we make it more commercialized to give it more commercial value? So for some, research institutes, maybe they're preserving it somewhere in the world, but shall we open it to the public? And also, do you choose to upgrade your system instantly, or do you choose to, prolong the process? Like wait till you do not have any other choice?
I do apologize. This was not working for the early part of the question. So I heard the last part, but not the first part.
So first the question is preserving hardware and software, which is more difficult, and what is the best way to preserve it? Shall we open it to the public that more people use it to give it more commercial value, or we just leave to the professional institutes to preserve it? And then the second question is, when the system tells you that now you can update it, do you always choose to update it instantly, or do you choose to wait it till you do not have other choice? So it's a more personal question.
Well, personally, I wait till I have no other choice, but that's partly because I do deal with historical things, and I usually want to run the older stuff. But in terms of access, which is really, I think, what you're asking, when it comes to older hardware, it is very delicate, hard to maintain. It requires expert help. So, for instance, at the museum, we have 2 restorations, and each one requires a team of volunteers to keep it going. One is a IBM 1401 mainframe, the other's an early mini computer, the PDP-1. But it's a real effort to keep that going. The emulation lets people actually use older software in a fairly, depends, but a reasonably authentic form on newer hardware. So personally, I think, emulation is the way to bring really wide public access to older materials. The hardware, first of all, again, the problem of keeping it going, but also knowing what to do with it, because games, for instance, we have 3 interactive emulations of games where you can go up and play in the museum. Games are designed to be instantly understood and fun, and people enjoy them. For the 1401, this IBM mainframe, they demonstrate it with people who are experts on it from the time, and they show people what you do with it, because if any of us, including me, just walks up to it, it takes punch cards in, prints out results. Lee might know how to to interact directly with it, but it's a mystery to the average person. So I think it's really, you want to show videos and demos for most things that are not self-evident, like a game, and the hardware should generally be demonstrated rather than just turned over. Lee.
This brings up the idea of the computer in cultural context and how that has changed. It's a very big field, and I don't expect that, we could rough out a plan for it in a few hours. It's going to take years, I think. But I think that would be a very interesting direction for the Computer History Museum. After all, history has to be seen in context to be understood. And while you can have all of the best display furniture, you don't learn much about why they were designed the way they were, and what people did and what difference it made in their lives. So allow me, if you will, to complicate your task by many orders of magnitude by throwing this suggestion into the pot. I'd like to know what it sounds like to you.
Well, I think it depends whether you're talking about in-person or off-site. So what I've said in other contexts is, on the floor of an exhibit, people if you don't get their attention within about 30 seconds, maybe a minute or 2, you've lost them. It has to be bite-sized, self-contained. On the other hand, at home, with their own machine and an emulator, the people who are interested can explore and actually explore older systems. So I think it's which context it's in, and a museum can provide both. So, for instance, right now, the Internet Archive provides lots and lots of older games emulated that you can play. You're obviously not going to experience the original hardware, the look and feel, the smell of it, but it's something that you can do at your leisure. Whereas to give someone an ancient machine working and no time to explore it doesn't serve much purpose. So it is a very complicated question, which we've wrestled with. And for instance, for the chatbots exhibit, we're probably going to do videos of people demoing even current systems, like a chatbot for therapy, a chatbot for customer support, things like that. If you let people play with it, a lot of them are just going to, get lost in some instruction. Or, for instance, we have a Wikipedia exhibit where there's a terminal. You can go up and edit Wikipedia. The whole point is Wikipedia is something anybody can edit, right? People did that. They put up all sorts of horrible things, and now that IP address is banned by Wikipedia. Because if people really are free to play with things, they play in many different ways.
Hi, Ms. Weber. I have a question about the HCI. Do you think the HCI, the human-computer interface, is reaching their end? Because in 1960, we have the video terminals. Instead, teletypewriters becomes major human-computer interface. And until today, we still have the keyboard video display as our HCI, a human-computer interface. Like the alternative way, like VR headset, it's developing from 1980s and got a lot of investment in the 2010, in the past 15 years about. But still, it cannot instead the traditional HCI, like a keyboard and a video monitor. And the only thing a little bit changed is the handheld devices. When we get the first PDA, like the Palm Pilot in 1996, and until today we still have a handheld device, a touch screen, big icons. It seems almost same to the very early Palm Pilot. So, do you think the human-computer interface is already reaching their end as today? Thank you.
Well, I hope not. But I think this is a typewriter, basically, which is now 150 years old almost, a screen or a piece of paper above a keyboard. The whole history of mobile is actually how do you get something that is not with a big screen and an easy way to enter data to do something useful. And it's worth remembering that these now no longer have either a pen, like the Palm Pilot, which you could write fairly quickly and accurately when you got good at it, or the thumb keyboard, like the old Blackberries. The soft keyboard is actually very hard to accurately use. So these have become, since the iPhone and Android really followed the same model, they're maximized for browsing rather than creating. And that gets back to this thing of like the early web was meant to be participatory. This is a browsing, it's a broadcast receiving machine rather than a way to create. And that's part, I think, of why we do, Twitter and kind of micro-blogging has taken off, partly because it's not that easy to write long form on these devices. And actually, John Markoff, the journalist and author, wrote, when we did an iPhone anniversary at the museum, he wrote an article for us called The Downward Gaze, meaning that if you think about it, why are we constantly looking down at our phones and crashing and tripping? Because we need to look to type. With the older thumb keyboard, people got extremely good at blind typing, also with mobile phones. So we're probably spending 60% of our time on a phone staring at the screen to make sure we've accurately entered the text. So that's just one example, I think, of how HCI, those decisions are tremendously important. They're far from over. The humor magazine, The Onion, had a great article, which I've quoted, that we spend, studies show we spend 80% of our time looking at glowing rectangles. So we wake up in the morning, we go to the side, and we pull this little glowing rectangle, the phone. Then we go to work, we look at a bigger one, and we come home at night, and we relax with an even bigger one. And it's like, why have computers not broken out from the confines of screens? People have talked about tangible computing and text on walls and smart paint and all of this for decades, but where is it? We're still staring at these tiny little rectangles. So I think there's a lot of wide open territory there.
Hi, thank you, Mark. I have a pretty long question, and I wrote it. Just let me read it about hypertext. And you mentioned that, and I was thinking that hypertext was really important during the transition of personal computing to network computing during the 90s and maybe the 2000s. But in a sense, hypertext is in a strange situation of being the genre that has been most written about in the field. But it seems that simultaneously that the genre least actively pursued by writers today. And instead of it is as a specific genre in its own right, elements of hypertext has opened up to like new forms, like new mediums. And some essential aspects of hypertext are present in many contemporary genres of electronic literature, like some VR works or some interactive fictions. But I would like to ask, what is the importance of hypertext today? And I remember a quote from Robert Coover. He used to say that, never forget how interesting it is to read electronic literature. So is it interesting, is it still interesting? Because it seems like reading news online is like we are reading fiction. So hypertext fiction or hypertext, will it simply be just an archive thing? Or is there anything more interesting or something, or some more possibilities of hypertext itself? Thank you.
So and actually we've interviewed Robert Coover for the museum, but the high kind of creative writing in hypertext has remained more of a kind of side genre. But I would argue that we're using it, again, almost anything we do on the web, we're using hypertext constantly. It's the way we access news, reference information, obviously social media. So I mean, it's such a fundamental part of the way that we navigate content that I don't think it's gone away at all. It's true that books have remained fairly traditional. Although even then, when you read a Kindle book, you're often jumping to a definition or something else without even thinking about it. But the original idea of these choose-your-own-adventure books, where you create the narrative, have not taken off so far as books. But I would argue that in games they have to some extent. You have games where you're effectively shaping the narrative by your actions. I mean, hypertext, again, there's hypertext and there's hypermedia. People like Ted Nelson were looking much more to a hypermedia with video and other forms, other media. And we have, if you look at modern games and using the web today, it is all hypermedia. So I think it's there. Personally, I think there's a mental kind of effort. When you read something for entertainment, you don't necessarily want to make decisions. You want to listen to a story. You don't want to create a story. So I think there's a tension, movies, for instance, there's no technical reason that you cannot have a hypertext, a hypermedia movie where you simply make a decision and put the plot into a different direction. But that hasn't taken off. And my guess, and it's purely a guess, is that's because people want to sit back and be passive in that context. They don't want to choose their own adventure when they're relaxing on their third screen of the day after the first two. But it's worth, the hypertext link, though, has become with AI, both the older form of machine learning on the web and now generative, a link is no longer just a link. It can be all sorts of complex calculations going on in your interest or someone else's. So it's creating a truly dynamic medium. Hypertext has gone far beyond sort of a static pointer, which is an old-fashioned link. So I think it's all around us. But that particular form of literature has not become mainstream. That's true. I don't know if I answered it.
好，非常感谢马克韦。
We thank Professor Mark Weber for your serious answer and for those people who have raised their questions. Let's put our hands together for his wonderful speech. Next, we're going to have a break of around 10 minutes.
got the waves.
She was already dead.
Got the waves.
She was already dead.
Welcome back. Our next speaker, who is also the last speaker of this conference, is Rodrigo Ochgam, who is anthropologist and historian of computational and artificial intelligence. He's currently an assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Leiden University. His research examines orthodox models of computational rationality, such as non-classical systems of logic in Brazil, Indian non-binary Turing machines, and Cuban information science frameworks. His teaching specialties including contemporary social and anthropological theory, the history and anthropology of science and technology, and the social dimensions of digital technology. He received his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD degree from MIT. His speech is entitled Counter-Histories of Computing. Let's welcome him.
Great. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm impressed by your hospitality and by the precious intellectual connections you've been cultivating here. The history of computing is typically told in ways that privilege influential actors supported by powerful institutions in metropolitan centers. Mainstream histories focus on models of computing that have become the dominant ones. And some computational models are now so dominant that they are often even regarded as universal. Today, I want to show how even the most foundational computational models are not universal and can be reimagined in radically different ways. I will do so by offering counter-histories of computing. I will focus on peripheral actors who imagined and developed unorthodox computational models that were ignored, suppressed, or marginalized. I will consider I will consider counter-histories of 4 major kinds of computational models, all of which are adopted by ubiquitous digital technologies. The most basic is mathematical logic, so every computer program or algorithm is composed by a sequence of logical operations. Another is the Turing machine, the abstract model of binary computation with zeros and ones, which is at the basis of all modern digital computing. I will also consider models of information, particularly those in the field of information retrieval, which is at the basis of all modern search engines like Google or Baidu. And finally, models of language, for example, those used for machine translation or conversational automata like ChatGPT. So each of these models is based on certain assumptions. A mathematical logic tends to assume absolute consistency. A statement is either true or false. Turing machines are designed for absolute certainty, and each algorithm has a determinate output, 0 or 1. Systems of information retrieval strive for a sort of neutrality. They don't want to be seen as politically partisan. And computational models of language have traditionally sought to set the poetic aspects of language aside. Poetics are not incorporated explicitly into the models, even if the outputs may be interpreted in poetic ways. So I will tell you about 4 counter-histories of computing, which challenge each of these assumptions. So my first story is about the emergence of non-classical systems of logic in Brazil. This is Newton da Costa, a Brazilian mathematician who pioneered the field of non-classical logics. This field studies systems of mathematical logic that challenge the classical commitments to absolute consistency and to a binary division of truth and falsity. Da Costa developed a prominent kind of non-classical logic called paraconsistent logic, starting in the 1950s. Paraconsistent logics are those which permit inference from inconsistent information in a non-trivial fashion. So in a paraconsistent system, a proposition P and its negation not P can be true simultaneously. But this is not the case for any proposition, because if it were, the logical system would be trivial. So a paraconsistent logic is one in which only some propositions, but not all, can be inconsistent. In short, a paraconsistent logic allows for partial contradictions. Now, this is quite abstract, but I wanted to know where this idea of partial contradictions had come from. So a few years ago, I interviewed Newton da Costa. He was 90 years old at the time and arguably remains the most influential logician in Latin America. The interview lasted several days. Now, the first day we met, he gave me a book of poetry in Portuguese titled Para Consistência,
Paraconsistency, signed by an author, a poet named Lars. He told me that Lars wanted to meet me, but wasn't able to join in person. The poems touched on intimate topics, from love and death to the existence of God, through the lens of partial contradictions. Now, at the back of the book, Lars noted that one of his inspirations was paraconsistent logic, the fact that, quote, someone from our wild land had come up with a method able of manipulating the contradictions, the chaos, the ultra-complex, unquote. Now, over time, especially after studying Newton's personal archives, I came to suspect that Newton had written the poems himself, and that Lars was his alter ego. Now, when I asked him about this, he smiled, but neither confirmed nor denied it. Now, ever since, in our correspondence, I asked Newton to send my regards to Lars. I received news from both. Now, Da Costa was not alone in seeing the world as contradictory, chaotic, and ultra-complex, or in framing Brazil, in particular, as a wild land where contradictions were especially salient. Indeed, these were common tropes in Brazilian modernist art, literature, and philosophy. Da Costa and his colleagues were deeply influenced by the Brazilian modernist movement, and I traced many connections and interactions between mathematicians and modernist artists, writers, and philosophers. Now, Brazilian modernists often argued that formal logic didn't apply to Brazil's contradictory social reality. For example, the Manifesto Antropófago, or Cannibalist Manifesto of 1928, claimed, "We never permitted the birth of logic among us." Now, this painting by Tarsila do Amaral, which accompanied the manifesto, featured a subject with a minuscule head, representing this rejection of logic as a kind of anti-colonial statement. Now, Da Costa and other mathematicians agreed that formal logic, at least in its classical Western form, was incompatible with the contradictions of social reality. So they wanted to formalize a mathematical logic that would permit contradictions. Now, this logic had consequences for the project of artificial intelligence. Brazilian researchers realized that it might be impossible to simulate human intelligence without moving beyond classical logic. For the logicians who advanced the concept of paraconsistency, classical logic was not universal, but highly particular. It was merely one of infinitely many possible forms of logic. Moreover, classical logic does not reflect the patterns of reasoning of any human being. Actually, existing rationalities are always paraconsistent, they claimed, whether the subjects were scientists or lay people, indigenous, Brazilians, or European. Now, in this sense, the paraconsistent logicians advanced an alternative universalistic project of their own. They maintained the positive assumption that logical formalisms could somehow capture the foundations of rationality. But they moved beyond the original project by turning away from a normative ideal of absolute consistency and toward a radically inclusive description of the endlessly plural manifestations of human reasoning. Now, Brazilian mathematicians were not the only ones who, to imagine non-binary forms of logic and computation. So let's move to another story from across the world, the imagination of non-binary Turing machines in post-colonial India. In the aftermath of India's formal independence from British colonial rule, computers became part of Jawaharlal Nehru's vision of a rational post-colonial nation. A major project on digital computers was centered at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, which had been founded and long been directed by Bengali statistician Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis. Now, in the early 1950s, Mahalanobis and his staff embarked on a quest to import or manufacture India's first computers. By 1953, the Indian Statistical Institute had designed an analog machine that could solve simultaneous linear equations of up to 10 variables, made from materials salvaged from Second World War surplus in scrap heaps. Nehru came to see the machine, and Mahalanobis stressed that we have built it ourselves. Mahalanobis immediately started to investigate the possibility of a general-purpose digital computer, seeking help simultaneously from the United States and from the Soviet Union. Confidential documents uncovered by historian Nikhil Menon revealed that the U.S. Department of State worked to prevent Mahalanobis from obtaining technical aid because of the department's perception of his Soviet sympathies. During this period, Mahalanobis looked to Indian philosophy in search of alternative models of logic and statistics, which would later inspire the imagination of different kinds of computers. Now, at a symposium in 1953, Mahalanobis presented what he called some ideas in the Indian Jaina theory of Syadvada, which aroused much interest. Now, what is Syadvada? According to philosopher Janardhan Ganeri, Syadvada may be understood as a theory of the conditionalization of assertion. The theory recommended conditionalizing any statement with the particle syat, which Ganeri translates as somehow, and Mahalanobis translated as maybe. There are various different accounts of the theory in ancient Sanskrit texts. Some accounts include a seven-fold division of types of statement or modes of predication. They're called sapta bangji, which were the focus of Mahalanobis' analysis. He referred to it as a logic or a dialectic, rendering and translating its 7 categories as follows. So maybe it is, maybe it's not, maybe it is and it's not, maybe it's indeterminate, maybe it is and also indeterminate, maybe it's not and also indeterminate, maybe it is and it's not and also indeterminate. Okay. So the first 3 categories, Mahalanobis noted, conform to the categories of classical logic, right? Assertion, negation, and both. Now note that Mahalanobis performed substantial interpretive work in framing the Jain theory called Syadvada as analogous to the Western category of logic, and the semantic predicates called Banji as analogous to truth values. Okay? Now neither analogy is self-evident, and both rest on some measure of simplification. But in any case, the 4th category, avakta, is even harder to translate. Mahalanobis chose to translate it as indeterminate, noting that other authors also used indescribable, inexpressible, or indefinite. Now, Mahalanobis saw avakta as analogous to the concept of mathematical probability. Now, a few years later, this reinterpretation of the theory of Syadvada would inspire an effort to imagine a non-binary model of computation, replacing binary logic with a 7-fold theory of predication. This line of work, initiated by Mahalanobis, was advanced in collaboration with British-born biologist J.B.S. Haldane. Numerous Western scientists visited India, especially the Indian Statistical Institute, in the aftermath of independence. One example is Norbert Wiener, the founding figure of cybernetics, who imagined that India could become the site of a scientifically advanced and technologically automated future, since Nehru could follow what he called an alternative path to industrialization through the early introduction of the automatic factory. But Haldane went further. He didn't just visit India for a semester or a year. He moved permanently, becoming a professor at the Indian Statistical Institute and eventually an Indian citizen. This move was linked to his anti-colonial politics. In 1956, days after the United Kingdom, France, and Israel attacked Egypt in an attempt to seize control of the Suez Canal, Haldane resigned from his post at University College London. He told the Times newspaper, "I do not want to be a citizen here any longer because Britain is a criminal state." So he moved to India, studied Sanskrit, and joined Mahalanobis in reimagining computers through the lens of Jainism. Now, existing digital computers, whether British or Soviet, were based on binary logic. This had been the case since the earliest digital computers, such as the ENIAC, completed in 1945. Now, Alan Turing's mathematical model of computation from 1936, which has since become known as the Turing machine, also assumed binary operations. It consisted of a memory tape divided into discrete cells, each of which could contain one of 2 symbols, 0 or 1. Now, Haldane envisioned a machine that would support avakta in addition to 0 and 1. He wrote, such a machine could give any of 7 responses, namely 0, 1, avakta, 0 or 1, 0 or avakta, 1 or avakta, 0 or 1 or avakta. Okay? So in effect, this was a non-binary Turing machine. Now, this abstract model never materialized into an actual physical computer. And today's computers are almost invariably based on binary logic. There were a few exceptions, notably in the Soviet Union, around the mid to late 20th century. Now, there are many reasons that contributed to the dominance of the binary model, but in principle, non-binary computers, even computers based on different philosophies, are possible. Now, I've presented cases of very theoretical and abstract fields of computing. Now I will turn to a third case about a more practical and applied field, the distinctive field of informatics as it developed in post-revolutionary Cuba. In the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro appointed librarian Maria Teresa Freire de Andrade as the new director of the José Martí National Library in Havana. A lesbian and longtime dissident who had been exiled and jailed by the previous regimes, she had long been concerned with the politics of librarianship. After the revolution, Freire de Andrade argued that Cubans could not simply, in her words, copy what the English do in their libraries. By doing so, she said, we would have a magnificent library. We would have it very well classified. We would provide a good service to many people, but we would not be taking an active part in what the revolution is. So what did she mean? How could librarians take an active part in the revolution? Now, one answer was to gather and index materials that had been excluded and suppressed from library collections in the pre-revolutionary period, such as publications of the clandestine revolutionary press of the 1950s. But librarians also became involved in a broader revolutionary project, Cuba's effort to build its own computing industry and information infrastructure. This project ultimately led to a distinctive new field of information science, which inherited some of the revolutionary ideals of Cuban librarianship. Now, both the revolutionaries and their enemies recognized that information technology would be a strategic priority for the new Cuba. In 1962, IBM closed its Cuban branch, and the US government imposed a trade embargo that prevented Cuba from acquiring any computer equipment. This meant that Cuba would be forced to develop its own computing industry with help from other socialist countries in the Soviet-led Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMECON. Now, in 1970, a team at the University of Havana created a prototype of a digital computer, the CID-201, as well as a programming language named LEAL, short for Lenguaje Algorítmico, or algorithmic language, an acronym which also means loyal. Because of the US imposed trade embargo, the team could not buy the necessary electronic components in Europe, but eventually succeeded with the help of a Cuban man of Japanese descent who worked as a merchant in Tokyo in bringing the components from Japan hidden inside briefcases. Now, what's remarkable about Cuban informatics is how it developed new theories and mathematical models that diverged from those of both US and Soviet informatics. Cuban information scientists tried to encode their political ideals into their mathematical models of library activity. The Cuban models are often much more complex. I won't go into the mathematical details here, but I just want to make a brief note about their underlying political principles. So US and Soviet information scientists often used metrics of popularity, like citation counts, to choose which materials to keep and which to discard. Cuban information scientists rejected those metrics of popularity. They were deeply concerned with ensuring a diversity of points of view in library collections. The point is that they understood that systems of information retrieval can never be neutral. When an algorithm chooses how to rank search results or selects which videos to recommend on a feed, this is always a normative decision with political consequences. And Cuban information scientists embraced this inevitable political partiality. Now, when I did research on Cuban informatics, there was almost no material that I could find easily available online, at least in English. And after the publication of my first article about it, Wikipedia editors almost immediately, like literally the next day after the online publication, immediately contacted me and created new entries on Freire de Andrade and the CID-201 computer. I'm quite honored to have played a role in the public documentation of this history, and glad to have this first-hand experience with the politics of information systems. Now, the Cuban experiments in informatics were supported by a socialist state. But I should also note and present a case in which a more authoritarian socialist state repressed alternative experiments, forcing them to move underground. So my last story is about machine poetics in former Czechoslovakia. Computational models of language have always tended to focus on the most on the basic and literal aspects of language, and to suppress or set aside the poetic and aesthetic aspects. Warren Weaver, the US scientist who was arguably the first proponent of machine translation, put it this way in 1955. No reasonable person thinks that a machine translation can ever achieve elegance and style. Pushkin need not shudder. Now, that's why the earliest projects of machine translation focused on scientific and technical documents during the Cold War. Scientific prose was perceived as simpler, more direct, and easier to translate. Now, this tendency persists in present-day machine translation systems and conversational automata, which are based on metrics of semantic similarity, but do not consider poetics explicitly in the design of the models. Now, in former Czechoslovakia, the early projects in machine translation and computational linguistics also conformed to this tendency overall. However, at the margins of those projects, there were surprising exceptions. Linguists, engineers, writers, and scholars worked to appropriate the very first computers in Czechoslovakia for literary purposes and to develop language models which explicitly incorporated poetics. Czech literary theorist G.D. Levy sought to formalize the aesthetic decisions in the process of translation, using various mathematical models like information theory, game theory, and statistical decision theory. Unlike US and Soviet projects of machine translation, Levy imagined that computers could be used for translating literary texts, including poetry. Another linguist, Květa Zgalova, was inspired by Levy's critique of mainstream computational linguistics and worked on probabilistic models of poetic language. Now, why did this sort of work emerge in Czechoslovakia? Now, one precondition was the intellectual influence of the Prague linguistic circle from the pre-war period, which had theorized the poetic or aesthetic function of language. For later Czech structuralists like Levy, language could be divided into two structures, the semantic and the aesthetic, which were equally amenable to mathematical formalization. Now, most of the published works that developed mathematical or computational models of poetic language appeared in the mid-1960s. Earlier in the 50s, structural linguistics had been seen as controversial by the Soviet-aligned regime because of late Stalinist polemics that had framed structural linguistics as incompatible with Marxism. Many linguists were purged from Czechoslovak universities. Some were exiled, while others renounced structuralism publicly and pledged allegiance to Marxism. The brief period when political repression loosened in the mid-1960s is when most publications about machine poetics appeared. Now, some of this work involved using computers to automatically compose poetry. A few people even deployed computer-generated poetry as a mode of political critique. So during the Prague Spring in 1968, one researcher collected official statements by a very high-ranking politician, then used the computer to generate absurd lines with parodic, official-sounding statements. Now, the results were published in a magazine article titled Generative Degeneration, just a few months before the tragic Warsaw Pact invasion. But after the invasion and subsequent repression, most researchers of machine poetics were punished and removed from academic positions. In a few cases, researchers were punished at least in part because of the perception of their work as subversive. This seems to be the case with the author of Generative Degeneration. In other cases, researchers were punished mostly for their personal views and actions, not so much for their academic work. But this seems to be the case with Zgalova, who was removed from her faculty position and allowed to work only as a librarian. Now, for one reason or another, almost everyone who worked on machine poetics could not continue doing so in universities after the invasion. Now, this did not mean that the research stopped completely. During the 70s and 80s, a group of people interested in mathematical studies of poetic language, including Zgalova, organized underground meetings in different apartments around Prague. This was informally called the Evening School of Versology, which circulated their findings in self-published typescript, or samizdat. Well, Dorota Olszewska, a former student of mine who supported my research through an internship, visited Květa Zgalova in Prague last year for a preliminary interview in one of the apartments where those underground meetings happened half a century ago. Zgalova still considers her research on poetic language the most important work of her life. Still, she was surprised that we had learned of her work's existence after such a long time and from far away in the Netherlands. So she was also curious about what sort of research we were doing, so Dorota sent her my article on Cuban informatics. After reading a machine translation of my article, she agreed to help us and even searched her apartment for old correspondence. Now, ironically, this encounter wouldn't have been possible without language models in their existing commercially available anti-poetic forms. Now, I first learned of Zgalova's ideas by reading papers machine translated from Czech. And I now know from Dorota's more careful translations that I had missed or misunderstood various things. But from the beginning, despite the limitations of mainstream machine translation, I could still sense what was important, even beautiful, about the work. Now, a computational model can try to suppress the poetically, but cannot do so fully. And this is part of a more general pattern in all of my stories. Computational models can be designed to suppress the inconsistent, the uncertain, the partisan, and the poetic, but they never succeed completely. Despite all the attempts to get rid of inconsistency, uncertainty, politics, and poetics in models of computing, there are always people who raise objections. There are even people who express those objections by developing alternative computational models. There are always people who imagined ways of computing otherwise. So I suppose that includes the extraordinary community I met this week in Shanghai. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and also the 4 interesting stories or cases. And you showed us in those orthodox models. Behind those models, we also have the poetic, unorthodox models. So let's open the floor to see if our audience have any questions for you. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. You shared 4 cases, and to some extent, they are unorthodox. And they also include the control theory and also the computer model development. And I did some research on the control theory, and I was looking at the United States, the USSR, and China, and I was looking at the comparison among these 3 different countries. And I saw your presentation. I think that these 3 countries can be compared with each other. But one thing really confused me is that when I was doing this research, be it Chile or USSR or China, this unorthodox narration was eventually included in the orthodoxy way of narration, because I feel like they are more like a historical legacy right now. So my question is, those unorthodox culture, is there any direction that we can take to, preserve them, or any method we can make to prevent them from becoming simply historical legacies? So that's my question, and to see if you have any answer to my question, or any practices or any projects you can share with us. So any attempts, any cases you can share with us? Thank you.
That's a great question. So, it is true that when I look for historical cases of unorthodox models, a good deal of the things that I find were things that whose ideas ended up getting incorporated into, you know, like kind of mainstream models of computing in one way or another, right? It's difficult to find something that, that, you know, fits all of my criteria, and one of which I think it is, you know, I look for cases that, you know, help us defamiliarize the models that are prevailing today, right? I explicitly look for those cases where, in which some basic assumption that came to be treated as universal and that people don't question was questioned, right? And usually you find those, you find that mode of questioning very early on, right? You know, when a certain formal model kind of begins to circulate worldwide in one way or another. Yeah. Now, I would be super curious to learn about your research in control theory and the comparisons from cases around the world, and especially the empirical material that you find that you found in China. And in general, I would be very excited if there were people here interested in doing, you know, research into unorthodox forms of computing that have been developed in China. I think that's very much. I would imagine that there's a lot of stuff, right? A lot of really fascinating stories yet to be told, and you know, if I can support those efforts in any way, you know, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I will do. I will do all I can, given the, you know, within the constraints of anti-poetic mainstream machine translation, to support that line of work. Now. One of the reasons why I do this work, too, is that I want to inspire experiments with different ways of computing now, right? You know, I see this kind of historical work, you know, and ethnographic work as you know, a strategy, you know, to help people imagine, right? You know, to give a concrete example of how things could have looked otherwise, even if they were not, you know, fully implemented, even if they did not succeed, even if those were abandoned ideas, you know, there may still be elements of those ideas that people can take up now and can inspire people to do experiments, including, you know, they don't necessarily need to be, you know, kind of pragmatic or utilitarian experiments of actually developing, you know, like platforms for widespread use, you know, even though that would also be really cool. You know, they can even be artistic experiments, right? For, you know, just to show a concept or show how some of those ideas could be expressed now. And yeah, there have been a few of those experiments in a kind of artistic direction. That was a kind of unexpected experience for me. Because so earlier this year I presented some of this material, some of these stories in Latin America for the first time, which was really significant for me. I presented it in São Paulo in Brazil, which is where I was born. I was very glad to be able to give a talk in Portuguese. I don't get to do that very often. And to my surprise, and it was for it's for a group of kind of local activists and artists. And to my surprise, a bunch of people, you know, were inspired and started doing little artistic experiments inspired by those case studies. But also, to my surprise, they all focused on the same one. Like the Indian case, the non-binary Turing machine. Like pretty much, you know, like there were maybe 5 different groups that did some artistic experiment based on these cases, and they were kind of all about the second story. In any case, you know, that this is also, you know, these kinds of experimentation, artistic and technological experimentation, are things that, you know, I am also very happy to support in however ways I can. Right? You know, although I am a programmer and I do have a kind of background in computer science, you know, that's not the. I am certainly not an artist, and you know, I just don't have the same sensibility that people like you do, and I understand that it's very hard. But if people who do have that sensibility, people who are artists, and you know, are skilled at this kinds of experimentation, you know, want to take these ideas up. Yeah, you know, like I'm entirely on board, and I will do whatever I can to support. Yeah, thank you.
好的，下一个问题。
Next question.
Hello? Okay. I was curious, so talking about the non-binary logic, I mean, so, for instance, early AI, symbolic AI, was very much hoping that, you know, classical logic would lead you to all the things we want AI to do.
Yeah.
That largely did not work out, a lot of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, when statistical AI started to rise 30 years ago, my naive understanding, I'm not a mathematician at all, but isn't some of that about dealing with uncertainty and probabilities rather than strict logical statements? And I'm wondering what the difference is between, you know, more statistical approaches that are used today and the non-binary logics you're talking about. I was also curious why you see modern automatic translations being anti-poetic rather than neutral or not trying to be poetic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes. Yeah, these are very helpful questions. So the Brazilian mathematicians who were involved in pair-consistent logic, when they had their critique of, you know, what they saw as you know, the bulk of work in AI, they very much had they very much had this kind of symbolic AI approach that you mentioned in mind, right? You know, like they, you know, this was at a time that kind of preceded the rise of these more probabilistic approaches to artificial intelligence. Now, it is true that, yeah, the formalism of mathematical probability, you know, is a way of dealing with uncertainty. And, you know, the kind of history of science literature on the history of mathematical probability is a particularly extraordinary one. You know, I'd say like that, you know, that's one of the topics that's been covered kind of like most deeply out of, you know, like any, yeah, out of pretty much, you know, any topic you can find in like history of mathematical formalisms. So I guess that's one of the reasons why I didn't choose to historicize, you know, that in particular. But it's true that, well, Mahalanobis, it was to mathematical probability that Mahalanobis initially drew the analogy, right? You know, like when he read this, you know, when he first drawing analogies between the Jane theory and mathematical concepts, the first analogy he drew was to mathematical probability because of the uncertainty aspect. And it's kind of only later on, a few years later, that the analogy to, you know, like a possible alternative form of a Turing machine that came up. Now you know, insofar as how that guides my work, that's, you know, I chose this case and I chose this story because it has this, you know, like underlying theme of a radical epistemological rupture, right, involved in a way that maybe mathematical probability doesn't quite have. Now, even another thing I should say is that non-classical logic formalisms, some of which are better known, like fuzzy logic, that look a little bit closer to mathematical probability because you represent a truth value as a real number between 0 and 1. Those were also seen as a little bit controversial when they first came up. When they first came up, and in fact, you know, I did find a story where Lotfi Zadeh, the mathematician who came up with fuzzy logic, actually met Newton da Costa at Berkeley in the 1970s, and they had, you know, like a little bit of a shared experience with having their mathematical work be dismissed in one way or another as either pseudo-logic or not logic. Right? Now, you know, on statistical approaches to AI and probabilistic approaches to AI, you know, one of the reasons why I'm not ready to call this book project completed is that I really want to have a case about an unorthodox model that diverges in some interesting way from artificial neural networks. Like I think that would be I think that I see that as a kind of missing piece in the story I want to tell, because not only because of just how influential those models are now, but I think that if for the types of philosophical claims I want to be able to make with this material, I think that some neural network story would be really good to have. Yeah.
感谢 Roger 给我的回答。
We thank Roger for his wonderful answer. So far, the 8th annual conference on network and so community will come to its end. Now, next, we would like to have Professor Huang to give a wrap-up speech. I believe you must feel a little bit tired and exhausted. I'm very grateful for your presence at today's conference. To be frank, as we all know, it's not so easy to make things happen here in China, especially for those that are especially interesting. So to make it happen itself is meaningful. We have arranged a couple of different annual conferences with different themes. And for these past 2 days, we have learned a lot. In the first one, from the perspective of artists, we have given a second, we are now thinking of taking a look at the trend that is going on. For the afternoon session, there seems to be a hot debate, and now we can see lively conversations going on. However, Anna cannot make it today to our conference, and this is really very regretful. And this morning, the discussion is even more interesting. We have an engineer who shared with us things that is hard to imagine by artists or humanists. Or Mark Webber talked about the history of the internet, and also his observation on the evolution of the media. And the last speech, shall I call it reactive? You know, we are actually so accustomed to a world that where everything is certain, everything is determinate. It's just like the Type-C interface that is universal worldwide. So, however, the world isn't that way, either for the academic communities or for the science communities. The trend of automation is happening or is going on. We do have some historical fragments that exist with us. There is meaning in finding out this historical moment. We find history in those important moments and fragments. That is the reason why we name our conference Impossibility, to be put into a quotation mark, impossibilities. Actually, we are always trying to find out possibilities within the framework of impossibilities. That is why we themed our conference as counterculture. And I wish to thank once again the participation from all of our friends here. Although we don't have quite many with us today, we do have online live streaming. Therefore, we have a lot more audiences online. In the future, we are going to turn our speeches into transcript, which is to be open to the public, and so that we can keep with us a relatively good record of everything that is shared here. At last, we wish to also thank working staffs. We have a lot of broadcasting teams, reception teams, and interpreters, etc. So let's put our hands for the hard work of our working teams. With that, we will conclude today's conference. We look forward to seeing you anywhere in this world so that we can discuss together how we can move together to make the world more interesting. This is what I am keen on. Thank you.